Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Love of Wisdom Book Club. This episode, I'm joined by Rebecca Mattis, and we talk about The Ape That Understood the Universe by Steve Stewart-Williams. This is sort of an introductory text to evolutionary psychology. It's really well written. It uses a little bit of humor and lightheartedness throughout the text, but also doesn't sacrifice any of the depth of knowledge or the explanation of the theories and data underlying them in order to achieve that. So it's a very accessible text for people who aren't necessarily as academically minded as other evolutionary psychology texts might require. It's really interesting and gives a very good overview of some of the psychological faculties that we have, why they've evolved, and how they manifest themselves in society. But also, he does a very good job of walking you through the process of creating and testing hypotheses. So, as I will say in the conversation at some point, I feel like this text teaches you how to think about things. It doesn't tell you what to think, it teaches you how to think about things. And so by walking through this process with Steve Stewart-Williams, you will gain a better ability, hopefully, to think about the world and test things out and to develop your own knowledge. So it's really useful, and it was a really enjoyable conversation. So yeah, without further ado, I hope you enjoy this conversation. So, The Ape That Understood the Universe. What did you think of it?
I thought it was great. I really liked it. I thought it was this really wonderful combination, a wonderful and rare combination of like breezy and comfy and very intellectually rigorous. And you don't always get those two. And what he gained in like humor,
Yeah.
there was nothing lost in understanding, which is very unusual, I find, especially in science books.
Yeah, it was definitely aimed at a more general reader, wasn't it? But yeah, I really appreciated the use of humor. There was one point that I was reading it while I was at my parents', and I genuinely laughed out loud when I read it, which was the start of the chapter on sex and sex differences. It started with a quote that said, "Everybody knows that there's differences between men and women, dot dot dot, apart from social scientists." And I couldn't help but laugh out loud at that, because it's something that I've encountered so many times. This sort of like pretentious intellectualism where it's like, no, it can't, there can't be differences. Whereas if you speak to all differences being put down to social learning,
Yeah.
whereas when I interact with almost anyone else, with the exception of some activists, people will just go, of course there are differences. Why would you even ask that question?
He's just got some great zingers, you know. It's like, oh, I wrote them down, but of course now I can't find them. But he's like, oh, um, he's talking about sex differences, and he's talking about testosterone and how it affects men.
Yeah.
And he talks about how, here we go. This is a quote. most men's testosterone levels are dialed down when they form pair bonds, and dialed down even more when they become fathers. Are men socialized to secrete less testosterone under these circumstances? It's great. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think you sent me one earlier that I think makes a sort of good introduction to the whole thing. Like it works as a good segue into evolutionary psychology generally, which was that most psychologists have a big hole in their brain. Was it a hole in their knowledge or a hole in their brain?
A hole in their brain.
A hole in their brain where their knowledge of evolution should be.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know you had some knowledge of evolutionary psychology prior to this, but had you done much reading on it, or was this sort of the first?
The only reading that I had done that was in that realm was Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind. So that was the only book I had ever read that would be sort of under the umbrella of evolutionary psychology. But I had heard a lot from Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying about the subject. They've been talking about it all this time. And so it wasn't new to me at all. Like, the groundwork was laid in my mind for me to be able to read the book without freaking out,
Yeah.
Whereas at some point growing up in a blank slate culture, which I most certainly was raised that way.
Yeah.
The first time I was ever shown this other world was kind of a shock, and it took some getting used to. So I didn't have to go through that when I read this.
Yeah. I think I felt similarly. Like I definitely was certainly in my late teens, early 20s. I was very much bought into the sort of blank slate fallacy. I was convinced that everything was a product of social construction, and that I I think the reason for that is because we can intuitively look at a situation and go, baby boy given toy cars when he's younger, of course he's going to be interested in cars when he's older, and it feels intuitive. But I've actually got a very apt quote up on my wall in a postcard from my friend and previous practice educator by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle that says, "Nothing is more deceptive than an obvious fact."
Yeah. Well,
And
I think. Oh, go ahead. Okay. I was just going to say that that's one of the fundamental points of this book. He says the default presumption should be that humans are continuous with the rest of nature. And so when we look at the rest of nature and find, various, for example, sex differences or various ways that organisms behave toward their kin as opposed to non-kin, and we see these things repeated not just in the animal kingdom but even in the plant kingdom, that explanation automatically has so much more power than the deceptively obvious one that's just completely bogus.
Yeah, and I think where I came into, I mean, the groundwork had been laid for me for a very long time with from different areas. But I read last year The Blank Slate by Steven Pinker, which was tackling this whole thing. So it talked about it wasn't occasionally he went into the realms of evolutionary psychology, but it was more just a general psychology book that was like, look, here are some very clear differences between people that are innate. And he used twin studies and things like that. He used quite a lot from Judith Harris's massive book that I have the nurture assumption that I'm waiting to get round to, because it's a very long and intense book. But yeah, I think that because I read alongside this, I read a hunter-gatherer's guide to the 21st century by Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying. And they explained what they called the Omega principle for evolutionary biology, where they were basically like, if something has a cost and has been around for a long time, then the assumption should always be that it's adaptive rather than socially constructed until proven otherwise, because basically over the length of time that I think this is one of the things that came out for this book for different things for me. Over an extended period of time, anything that is finite in its existence will ultimately be subject to something like an evolutionary process. Because, sorry, yeah, anything that's finite in its existence, but also replication becomes a big part of that, because things that replicate therefore make themselves, they sort of transcend that finitude to some degree. That's a really bad way of explaining it, but the things that are inevitably best at replicating and extending their lifespan or their representation are the things that survive. And so one of the things that he clears up very early on in this book is how evolution actually works, because there are some things that I think people misconstrue about it, aren't there? Like, if you ask people to give a sort of layperson's definition of evolution, they will bring up things like survival of the fittest, natural selection, these sorts of terms, and they'll sort of understand how it works. But I think the counterintuitive thing, and this is maybe part of why people don't think of it in this way to the same degree, is that it happens at the level of genes, not the level of organisms. So it's not like survival of the fittest person, it's that the genes within the person that are best at replicating themselves over time are those that are most likely to become dominant in the population.
Yeah, and I really like how he lays that out. And I like how he lays stuff out throughout the whole book. He really does a beautiful job representing the arguments that are not his own. I mean, I think he steelmans just everything possible. And he, I really liked how he went through, the popular conception of evolution and just kept refining and refining and refining it and explaining every step. And he did that for other things as well. And it was really nice. It made it so easy to understand and to go along with him if you agreed with him. There were times that I didn't, but yeah, that was really well done, I thought.
Yeah, and I think there's a benefit to that beyond just a means of expressing the specific knowledge that he's doing, because what he's showing you there is how to think scientifically. He basically goes, here's a hypothesis. If you had this hypothesis, or here's a phenomenon, if you wanted to explain this, what would your hypothesis be? And he's like, it might be this. And he's like, but then you need to look at that critically, and here's the evidence that you'd have to look at. And actually, this evidence doesn't quite fit with that hypothesis, but we appear to be moving in the right direction. So there's some refinement needed. And then it's like, so you sort of refine it. And then he's like, but when we look at the evidence more closely, actually your hypothesis doesn't quite work still. And so we need to refine it a little bit further. And so that process to me is invaluable. I've seen it done in other books occasionally. It's not something that's very often represented. I think Jonathan Haidt's quite good for this as well. He basically goes, here's an idea I had, here's what I did to test it out, and here's where I was wrong, and here's what I was left with once I took into account all the ways I was wrong. But I feel like God, I've forgotten his first name. Steve Stewart-Williams. The thing that he did, I think he made this more explicit and took you on that through that process in a more step-by-step way that you can really translate to other issues.
Yeah, and it was so effective that I feel like the parts in the book where I disagreed with him and wanted to argue with him, the tools that I had to make my arguments are tools that I learned from him. So, that's great. To be such an awesome teacher, to give your student tools with which to disagree with you, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that happening very often in the modern day universities.
Yeah.
But
But to go on with his, like, with the first chapter, or the point of his book, or the main ideas of his book, I wanted to put a highlight on not only, so you were saying a highlight is, that evolution takes place at the level of the gene. And and the aspect of the book that I found really interesting, and that kind of was maybe the most mind-blowing, maybe that's too strong a word, but anyway, he said our real gimmick as a species is our culture. So he's like, what makes humans stand out is not our big brains, it's not our opposable thumbs, it's our culture. So there's that. And then he goes even further and he says, not only is it not about our big brains and our opposable thumbs, but it was culture that provided the selection pressures to give us such big brains and to give us such dexterous hands. And that's kind of meta, right?
Yeah, I feel like this is something that through this book and through A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide that I mentioned earlier, that was another thing that was very counterintuitive to wrap my head around, was that quite often social construction, which is usually used to say cultural influences, those sort of arguments paint it as dichotomous, that it's either evolution or it's culture. And what was very clear in this, it was like, well, if it wasn't for evolution, culture couldn't exist, and culture therefore is an evolutionary force in and of itself. And one of the roles that culture plays, because evolution is a very slow process, I think in some species of animals, they've been able to replicate evolution in about 7 generations in experiments, but that's experiment conditions speeding it up to the fastest possible level. And I actually had this debate with someone recently where they said that well, evolution can happen in a generation. And I was sort of like, I suppose that genes are passed on in a single generation. I had to go away and think about it. And it's entirely possible that in a generation there would be a very, very, very slight evolution in a population. Like very slight, but not to the point where it would have a statistically significant difference, I think, because say all of a sudden men with larger noses became popular with women, for reasons unknown, then we might expect that in the next generation there are a few more babies with larger noses because men with larger noses have been more successful. But to see that have any effect at a population level
Yeah.
would take a very long time, because there's a limited number of men with larger than average noses, and a change is very unlikely to happen at such a significant level that suddenly men with average or below size noses are left out of the sexual selection pool completely. So you would expect that over time, for that trend to have a significant impact on a population level is going to take a much longer time.
I mean, the only thing I can think of is something like the is it the pepperwood moth? Is that the name of the moth that has both black and white morphemes? And during the coal-fired era, like 100 years ago, all the moths that were black would be sitting around on trees that were also black, and so birds wouldn't see them, but they saw all the ones that were white and just picked them right off. And so the moth population turned black very quickly. And then after coal kind of went away and trees became more gray again, the white ones did come back, and it like turned white again very quickly. But I think even then it took more than one generation.
And you've got to think, I don't know what the average lifespan for a moth is, but I suspect that a moth generation passes in a very short space of time compared to humans. I don't think moths are going to live for a very long time. Say,
a generation's probably a year.
yeah, exactly. And so to see a population level shift in moths might take 10 years,
Right.
which would seem very sudden to us because that seems like rapid evolution, but that's quite a number of generations. So yeah, it's interesting because the argument he basically made about culture was that culture sort of evolved as a or I believe the argument was that culture evolved alongside human beings' sort of social structures and need to interact and exchange and things like that. It's part of being a social animal, but that culture was able to change and adapt quicker than biology. Therefore, culture gave us another evolutionary advantage because we could make adaptations on a population level quicker than we could have done if it was relying purely on selection to change traits and behaviors.
Yeah.
2 seconds. My laptop is making noises in the background because I've accidentally left a window open. There we go. I've gotten rid of it.
I wanna read a quote that says what you just said, but it's just such a nice definition.
I suspect he'll be a lot more succinct than me.
Well, it's a nice description, maybe not definition. He says, culture is a semi-autonomous evolving system made out of ideas. And I like it's semi-autonomous so that it's kind of doing its own thing, but it's also depending on human biology, but it's also affecting human biology. And, you know, it's doing its own thing, but it's limited. I guess it's doing its own thing, but it's limited by biology. But it doesn't mean it's unlimited. Doesn't mean it's, I'm just making it worse. I took 10 words. I should have just stopped there. A semi-autonomous evolving system. That's what I think is important.
So I think what you were trying to say is that to some degree it transcends the constraints of our biology, but it still is constrained by our biology. It's not this sort of limitless force that can make any adaptation. I think that's important to clarify, because I guess what could be misinterpreted from the argument that culture is able to adapt quicker than genetic evolution is, people can misinterpret that for what the conclusion that social constructionists often come to, which is if you just change everything about the culture, then you can completely rearrange society to alleviate whatever has been decided to be an issue at that particular time. You know, I feel like the easiest place to default to when it comes to speaking about evolutionary psychology is sex differences, just because it's sort of the place where blank slate arguments are most frequently brought up, in my experience. And so one of the interesting, or there's actually loads of studies that do this, but one of the interesting things that is brought to mind for me is like male and female differences in interest, where it's the biggest psychological difference that's been detected between men and women is difference in interest, where women are more interested in people and men are more interested in things on average across the population. And the social constructionists have always argued that this is because women are taught that they have to take on a caring role, to use some of the buzzwords, to do the emotional and domestic labor, whereas men are sort of taught to do the practical tasks. You know, you hear like the phrase pink and blue jobs, you know, men take out the bins and things like that. And we come back to what I was saying earlier about boys raised playing with guns and cars. But interestingly, Franz de Waal, the primatologist, he released a book, I can't remember if it was last year or the year before now. And I'm struggling to remember the specifics of the name. It was called I can't remember if it was What Chimpanzees Can Teach Us About Sex, or What Monkeys or What Apes Can Teach Us About Sex. It was something to that effect. Anyway, some of the studies they did is if you give a block of wood, just a rectangular block of wood, not rectangular. What's a 3D version of a rectangle? I don't know the word. But if you give a block of wood to monkeys, and I now can't remember if it was bonobos or chimpanzees, but if you give it to them, the female, I'm pretty sure it's chimps actually, the female chimps are more likely to pick up that block of wood and cradle it as if it was a child, whereas the males are more likely to try and use it as an instrument. So that's a pretty good indication that there's an evolutionary route to those differences. But the interesting thing that evidence is against the social construction argument is that if you do cross-cultural studies and rate the countries by their gender egalitarian social policy, with pretty much everyone agrees that the Scandinavian countries have done the most to eradicate differences between men and women on a policy level, that the differences become more exaggerated. Not exaggerated makes it sound like it's disingenuous somehow, but they become more prominent than they are in, say, the UK or the US, which not only does it contradict the social constructionist argument for gender differences, it actually suggests that the decrease is the product of social influence more so than the more so than any increase in it is.
Yeah. Yes. I was just going to talk about how he how it all comes down to, like, it all began with sex cells, and in the very beginning of sexual reproduction, you had female by definition cells, which are sex cells, which are large, and male sex cells, which are by definition small. And right off the bat, the female is investing more in sexual reproduction because it's making larger sex cells. So it's like that's kind of a tiny difference, but it like set evolution on this path to the female being the one that invests more in the offspring. And I really liked how he explored that pathway, from the very beginning of sexual reproduction, which was a billion years ago, was it?
A long time.
A long
I don't
time
think we need
ago.
to count the zeros.
But he says that particular sex difference can be slowed, or it can be equalized, or it can even be reversed in some species, but that process takes a huge amount of time. And he talks about, for example, seahorses who carry the young.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, in that this he was basically saying that sex differences are found at the level of parental involvement rather than at the level of, is this male or is this female? So the male seahorse has all the characteristics of a female, we might say, being nurturing and caring and all the rest of it, and the females are off fighting or whatever.
Yeah.
But that's because they are the ones that have greater parental involvement. So I like how he shines a light on what is actually the difference, rather than saying that all females are this way and all males are this way. He's saying there's a clump of traits that surround the higher parental investment sex. There's a clump of traits that surround that, and there's a clump of traits surrounding the sex that doesn't so much invest in its offspring. And I thought that was really interesting and powerful.
Yeah, and funnily, as you started saying that, that was exactly what I'd been thinking about. Was they're called gametes, is the sex cells. I looked the term up immediately before we did this because I couldn't remember it, and I knew that it was an important thing to bring up because that is how biologists define what is male and what is female in a species. They look at the size of the gametes, and the one with the smaller gametes is defined as male. So you end up with in men it's sperm are small and fast moving, whereas eggs. Yeah, I was trying to think. I was like, what? I was like, sure. Yeah, I don't know. I felt like there was a better word for it than eggs, but female eggs are larger than sperm and therefore slower moving, and that instantly means that just on the level of sperm and egg, there is competition amongst sperm for the egg because the sperm are faster moving and the eggs are slower moving, so they're going to get them. And so there's already a point where adaptations are going to evolve for the sake of optimizing the chance of the genes replicating. So some form of sexual selection is going to evolve between those gametes. And I like the fact that he basically said this is the only thing that's completely universal in terms of sex differences, because that's how we define sex. And so there are always exceptions to any general trend. But, you know, if it's true for 98 or 99% of species, then you can pretty much consider it a rule and deal with the exceptions as they arise, because there was a few exceptions that he did bring up.
But the exceptions didn't go against the definition, see? That's the beautiful thing about the exceptions. I mean, a male seahorse is a male seahorse.
Yeah.
You know, it's still male. You know, and it's being all nurturing and stuff. And so some human beings might say, hey, look at the seahorse. It can be gender nonconforming, right? But it's like, but that's not the point. You know, it just, they're still male. They just happened to evolve on a much less likely track, because the differences between egg and sperm are thumbs on a scale in a really big way, and it's such a powerful thumb that it points 99% of species down this path.
Yeah.
But it doesn't, but the exceptions aren't a problem. You know, the exceptions just point to the fact that, well, it was just a really big thumb on the scale, and these other creatures just sneaked out on this other path. And that's completely, it's not surprising when nature does surprising things.
So what you're saying is we don't need to prescribe hormone blockers to seahorses.
That's right. Exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying.
But so what I love about evolutionary psychology, it's something that I love about economics as well, and a number of things, is once you understand rules like that, then you can apply a logical formula to other things to work out what you'd expect and things like that. And so from understanding that one bit about parental investment and the difference it makes, you can then go, okay, well, what would we expect to see in this regard, or what would we expect and you start to build from that one very solid block. At this point, you know, it's very few people are willing to argue against something as concrete in science as evolution. From that block you can build up and build up and build up. And interestingly, I saw this article recently. I've seen two articles that have gone in completely contradictory directions. The first one was saying that science has been cheapened to some degree and left itself open to more issues because people have been determined to find something sort of revolutionary, and rather than trying to make tiny incremental steps in improving knowledge, people want to find a new thing. And so people are always looking for something novel, so we aren't getting those incremental steps. And then a few days later, I read something that was saying science is losing its originality and challenging the status quo because it's so focused on making small incremental steps that no one's trying to find anything new. And in fairness, the second article was the one that was backing itself up with data within the article. I don't know whether the first one had evidence for it, but I was thinking that's not a bad thing, because small incremental steps are probably the most accurate way of us developing something new. And if you have something exceptionally novel, there's a very high probability that it's wrong. Because you need, it's extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. It's that sort of saying in action. But this is what Steve Stewart-Williams sort of did in the book, is he built it up in incremental steps, like we've said. And so starting from the level of the gametes and the difference in size and parental investment, he was then like, here are differences that emerge on the organism level. And so it was things like I love the thing about the peacock and the ornaments is just it's one of the most difficult things to explain from an evolutionary perspective, I guess, because it doesn't serve any clear adaptive benefit. But basically, the explanation, because the larger gamete has a greater level of investment, it therefore has to be more selective about the lower level of investment gamete to make sure it has the optimum chance of survival. When you play that out in men and women's minimum investment in a child is 9 months of pregnancy, plus giving birth, and then you have a highly dependent infant. Men's minimal level of parental investment is basically about 2 minutes, a few pumps, and then goodbye. And one of the things that is unusual about our species, and he points this out a number of times, is actually the sex differences are smaller in our species than most other species, or than any other species, and particularly in terms of the parental involvement investment. And one of the reasons for that is because there was an evolutionary pressure with women of basically to gestate a baby to the point where it's very independent, in the way that, you know, if you see other mammalian species, they don't take years and years for their infants to be ready to be independent. Sometimes it's a matter of months, and some of them come out more or less sort of ready to go. You know, if you look at a giraffe, for example, a baby giraffe comes out pretty hilariously unsteady on its feet, but it's a giraffe. You look at it and go, that's a full-fledged giraffe, just waiting to grow. Whereas babies are much more dependent, and the reason for that is, if for them to gestate any further to the point of being less dependent, women's hips would have had to become wider, which would have posed difficulties for them running. So women with wider hips than what the average is now would have had less chance of survival over the millions of years that evolution took place. So the gene for wider hips was taken out of the gene pool, and so we ended up with these
limited.
Yeah, limit. Obviously, you do get a variation in hip width amongst the population, because evolution only ever works on average. It's not that you very rarely see 100% change across the population. But where was I going? So what that dependency means is that it basically requires more paternal investment and involvement, not 100% necessity, but in terms of the resources that are needed to feed both mother and infant during that period of dependency, it's going to be very difficult for a mother with a dependent child to obtain those resources without some sort of aid. And therefore, from a male evolutionary perspective, there's a risk that your infant doesn't survive if you don't invest more in it. And so that created the evolutionary pressure for more paternal investment. But what I was sort of going to say is that, going back to the ornament, that basically, because females are more sexually selective, although we have mutual sexual selection in the human species, it's still skewed quite heavily towards female sexual selection. And one of my favorite stats to back this up is that on Tinder, men swipe right on average for 60% of women, whereas women swipe right on average for 3% of men. So women are far, far more picky. and and that's because they have more risk because of the level of investment they're doing. But bringing that back to the peacock's ornament, basically, peacocks started to grow these tails because it was basically saying, I'm healthy, I have adequate access to resources, I'm eating well, I'm free of parasites, I'm good at evading predators, and I have this excess energy that I can put into just something to show off that will basically is like a flag saying, look at me, I'm a good mate. And because that was an indicator, it's like a secondary indicator of all these other things. Female peacocks selected the more colorful and larger tails over time, and eventually you reach, because it's an active disadvantage for survival purposes as well, because it's that predators can also see that flag. But that's why there is a limit to where this goes. You know, the tail can only get so big before peacocks start dying because their tails are too big and it's become impractical. But I think we can all agree that peacocks' tails are pretty big and spectacular, considering they don't serve any adaptive function beyond being a flag to say, look at me, I'm healthy.
Well, that kind of brings me to a point that would come next on my list of things to make is well, two things. So I think one reason that people get so upset about evolutionary psychology is that they are unhappy that, you know, nature isn't egalitarian, and they somehow think it's not fair that male peacocks have the fancy tails and peahens don't have them. You know, I'm making a joke. I don't think anyone actually feels that way, but it's as if they feel that way. And I think Steve Stewart-Williams keeps making the point that that natural selection and evolution, just because that happens and just because a trait is selected doesn't mean that trait is good or right or you know, morally proper. It's just that trait was selected for, and that's that. It's completely amoral. And to go along with that, if I can grasp after the thought that I had, is the idea that a trait doesn't necessarily help the bearer. You know, so a peacock's tail clearly is not good for the peacock, but it makes him more likely to reproduce. So that's a really beautiful example of evolution happening at the level of the gene and not for the sake of the individual. I mean, he may well die. Well, it's worse for him. It's worse for the individual to have a big tail. It just clearly is. But it's better for his genes because a peahen is going to like that better. And so the author just made that point over and over, and I thought that was really important to make because of this this kind of moral objection that people have to evolution. You know, it's not good for people, so it must not be true. Or you're either that, or, well, how dare you say that evolution happened this way because you're saying that that's how it has to be. No, it doesn't have to be. You know, women don't have to spend their lives barefoot and pregnant. You know, it's just that's an evolutionary trait.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something that I love the work of David Buss, who's like, he was one of the founders of the field of evolutionary psychology. and the amount of work he's done is just prolific. I reference him quite a lot in my assignments and things like that. He is, and every time I go down anything to do with evolutionary psychology, I get to a point where I'm like, okay, I need to try and find some papers that David Buss wasn't involved in, because it looks like I'm just using one guy's work. But then it's just like, I can't find a paper that he wasn't involved in, because he's just there for everything. I'm slightly exaggerating, but not to a huge degree. And he repeatedly makes the case that just because it is that way, it doesn't mean it should be that way. And evolution is, and I think part of this is because he deals with quite controversial topics. So I've got one book by his that's called The Murderer Next Door, which is about the human impulse to kill one another. And I'm reading a brilliant book at the moment called Bad Men: The Hidden Roots of Sexual Deception and Violence. I think he's got another name in the US that I can't remember the name of. But this book, because I work with a lot of domestic abuse, both perpetrators and victims of domestic abuse, and I've always found the explanatory theories on offer to be insufficient, and they just don't feel like they make sense to what I'm witnessing, and it's not something that this is something that was intuitive rather than empirical, but I was like, these explanations just don't match up. And then when I was reading through this book, I was like, this is so much more like what I'm actually witnessing and what it feels like is happening. And then he backed it up with data, but he basically keeps on making the case. He says evolution is amoral. Most of the things I'm writing about, I think David Buss write about, I think are morally reprehensible as well. But the key to addressing these issues is to understand why they exist, and therefore we have to understand why evolution created them. We can. One thing that I've had come up in a couple of debates now with people who I don't think are quite as familiar with evolutionary psychology. One of the criticisms that quite often comes up is, you're falling into the naturalistic fallacy,
Right.
which is the idea that what is natural must be good. And I keep having to point out that no, a naturalistic fallacy would be, so to continue using the intimate partner violence example, would be to say it's an evolved tactic for mate retention, to aid genetic replication, and the evidence suggests it is effective in giving people above average chances of procreation. Therefore, it's good. That would be the naturalistic fallacy.
Yeah.
But I am not naive enough to think that nature is good generally anyway. I think sometimes, and this is where the naturalistic fallacy comes into play, people have this idea that the animal kingdom, animals out in the wild are having a lovely time. They're free and doing exactly what they're meant to do, and they frolic through the meadows and things like that. And that's not what nature is like,
Right, exactly.
Most animals spend most of their time desperately trying to get enough calories to survive, and they're usually cold and hungry and scared and desperately trying to survive against all odds. And slowly, over hundreds of thousands of years, they get slightly better at doing that.
If I had any last vestiges of Rousseauian, nature is a paradise, people are born good, everything's good, it's all beautiful, the last nail in that coffin was that YouTube video of a little rabbit that was being attacked by a hawk, and this mother deer heard the rabbit screaming and came out of the woods thinking that the rabbit was her own fawn, and she trampled the hawk to death. And the right after she came on the scene, the rabbit runs away, and she's just, have you seen that video?
I have not seen this
Oh
video.
my God. This doe is crazy. She kills the hawk and she walks away, and then she just goes back and kills it more, and then she walks away and she goes back and she just pulverizes the hawk. And you're just like, there's no way out of the tragedy of that situation. There's no way out. Hawk, bunny, doe, there, you can't moralize your way out of that one. Nature is just, man, life is suffering, and nowhere is that better represented than in nature. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because that's right where I went to also, with the naturalistic fallacy. It's funny though, because this author, Steve Stewart-Williams, he makes that point. Just because it's evolutionary adaptation doesn't mean that it's good, right, or true. And then he goes, often the reverse is true. Doing the right thing means going against natural selection and trying to right nature's wrongs. But I don't think that's true either. I think that's a mistake, because to go against nature is just plain dumb. You have to manage nature. You have to be a nature whisperer, So these guys that are acting out of jealousy, and they're increasing their chances of having more offspring, and even though they're behaving in a completely vile fashion, the way to right nature's wrong in that case is to channel that somehow, or find a way to manage it, not to say, oh, jealousy is always bad, or this part of who you are is evil. I mean, that'll never work. So it's not about creating a morality that will fight against nature. It's about being pragmatic about how to nudge your culture in a more moral direction, working with what you've got.
Well, the analogy I always use for these things is that if I wanted to solve an equation and I was looking for a specific answer, if I didn't have the right numbers, aka the right understanding, then I'm never going to get to the right solution. If you said the number's 42, but you've got an 8 and a 30, and all you can do is multiply, then I'm not going to be able to get 42. It just doesn't work. But equally, when you understand when you have the numbers and the components of the equation, you then realize that there are still limits on the answer. And so to me, it's like understanding evolutionary psychology is trying to get the pieces of the equation correct, so that you understand it, and you can then look at what solutions are possible, and then go, okay, which is the preferable solution. And I think that this is sort of the human endeavor, really, with regards culture, is we're constantly trying to maneuver the equation components that we have to try and find a more desirable outcome. But some people, the idealistic, or so I guess what Steven Pinker would call the utopian view, or Thomas Sowell would call the unstrained vision, would be to just go, well, we want this answer, so let's just force that answer to come out of all of this, regardless of the numbers that we have. And yeah, that's always the analogy that I try and use to explain the amorality of it, because the intimate partner violence thing that I was explaining, well, not really explaining, but referencing, um, because of the different parental investment that we saw before, you get disparities in sexual selection, and you also get what social scientists would call mate value, which is basically a rough approximation of someone's desirability as a mate. And this will take into account different things for the different sexes, because there's different things they need. Like, men are far more visual because of the low parental investment, meaning that what they're basically looking for in a partner is someone who appears healthy and fertile, because they're the most likely to reproduce. And what women are looking for, because of their much higher investment, is they need someone who's going to provide those resources that are essential to increasing the probability of the child surviving. And it's not that these things are cut. I think this is one of the things that people don't like about both. For some reason, evolutionary psychology and economics always get very closely linked together in my mind, and I think that's because it's very economical, the evolutionary process, and it makes it sound like a calculated robotic cost benefit analysis to every single action, but it's not. It's that the genes that have given people a slight proclivity in one direction or another are the ones that have replicated most successfully, and therefore we have what would be, to use Freudian terms, would be the unconscious. Other people might call it the automatic cognition, but you have these processes like from our conversation with Jonathan Haidt, he had the elephant and the rider analogy. These evolutionary processes have caused the elephant to lean in a certain direction. They make you more likely on average to pick these certain things or to behave in this certain way. And because there's that difference, I'm doing that thing where I've jumped from one idea to another to another. I will bring it back round, though, I promise. So because there is that difference, men and women have different optimum mating strategies. And so what you find, where two different optimums are trying to find a compatibility between them, is that you evolve different strategies. Both people just evolve different strategies to bring each other closer to each other's optimum. So, rather than meet in the middle, it's more in the female interest that it goes slightly over that side, and it's more in the male interest that it goes slightly over that side, even if it's not getting 100% there. And so that's called sexual conflict theory. David Buss talks about it a lot. I'm pretty sure it's someone else who originated it, but their name escapes me right now. And what those strategies tend to look like is a gradual escalation to the point where they work. So I was speaking about mate value. One of the places that comes up is, say, if there is a change in mate value. So usually people tend to pair roughly to equal mate values. But it's not something that's static, because men and women desire different things. So women are far more likely to initiate divorce when a man has become unemployed. And that goes back to the same thing about needing to provide the resources that increase the potential survival of kin. Men, are more likely to initiate divorce with age, because a lot of the male sexual attraction is mediated by cues to fertility, And obviously age has a significant limiting impact on female fertility. And so mate values change, and what you find is that the lower mate value partner is more likely to use these strategies because their optimum becomes to retain their higher mate value partner, and the costs that they're willing to expend on it, because their mate value has decreased, the cost they're willing to expend on that increases. Whereas for the higher mate value partner, their best mating strategy actually now becomes to go and find a higher value mate who's more equal to their current mate value. Hence the divorce initiation being a good evidence that this theory is accurate. So some of the strategies might involve controlling behaviors, mate guarding behaviors. So things like being more publicly affectionate towards your partner to indicate to other people that they're taken, reading their messages going through their phone, something like that. Subtle manipulations. There's all sorts of different things, but when other strategies fail, then violence is actually quite effective at this. And the reason that the common theories don't tend to explain this is because the most common theory that's used is feminist theory, which basically says that it's to do with patriarchal society and it's for the retention of male power and dominion over women. But the research has failed to find a consistent link between individual holding of patriarchal views and the likelihood for perpetrating domestic violence. It's also failed to find a consistent link with overall society patriarchal views and rates of domestic abuse within that society. And whilst women tend to be the main victims of domestic abuse when it comes to accessing services, when you look at other measures of rates of perpetration, you tend to find that the levels of intimate partner violence are roughly equal in terms of men and women perpetrating them. There are some studies that say men are slightly higher. There are some studies that say women are slightly higher. There are quite a lot of studies that put them roughly equal. So this evolutionary explanation suggests that both are likely to do it when they think there's a risk to their relationship, and it's basically a method of trying to say, I'll draw you closer to my optimum in this situation. And it works in the short term at the very least. And some of the stats that are quite frequently used by the sort of feminist theorists are actually very good evidence of this. So like people who try and flee domestic abuse tend to try and flee multiple times before they're successful. So that suggests that the use of domestic violence is preventing that person from fleeing. There's also a really high rate, although the studies I've looked at for this show a really high rate of people who fled domestic abuse returning to their partners. They are very limited because there's not that many studies of this out there, and the sample sizes are quite small because they tend to be specifically done at an individual refuge. So it's not like, I think I found two decent studies on this, and their sample size was only about 30 people, 30 women. But so that ties in both the difference in parental investment and how it plays out in all these different ways in terms of sexual selection, how it creates different optimum for men and women, and how that creates a conflict. And one of the means that both men and women have evolved for dealing with this conflict is, amongst other strategies at its extreme end, is violence.
It's one of the things the thing that I stuck on when you were saying all that is that the lower value partner is willing to expend more cost to keep his higher value mate. Isn't that what you said? Then
his or her, but yeah, when they
yeah, that's what, yeah. I was using the his in the gender neutral old fashioned way. So
days.
So what really struck me with that is I actually heard someone relay this idea that some guy said. I don't know. I think I saw it in the YouTube comment section somewhere in some crazy video, saying that this guy who, abused his partner and went to jail made the argument that he loved his girlfriend so much that he was willing to go to jail to like make her stay with him. Like he was
Yeah.
he was showing that as like evidence of love, that he was willing to risk that. And when I read that, I thought that was completely insane. But now I understand that it was just a very, very clear representation of something that is this kind of ugly but real evolutionary strategy. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's both interesting and terrifying to some degree, like, and this is why Rousseau was so clearly wrong, in his view that sort of in our natural state we are good. I also don't believe the counter that in our natural state we are bad, because we've evolved for pair bonding and parental investment and all these things that we would consider to be morally good. It's very hard to say that are morally good, because we're talking about evolution. We're talking about a completely amoral process and then trying to put a moral framework on top of it. And it always brings me back to the famous Solzhenitsyn quote, the line between good and evil cuts through the heart of every man in the old-fashioned gender-neutral term.
But I wanted to not forget about the rest of the book, because we're only on chapter 3.
There's only like 5 or 6 chapters.
Yeah, well,
My first observation of this book was every chapter was really long and there wasn't many of them.
I did want to mention that one of the things I got out of this book that I had heard of but not heard so succinctly stated is this idea of the environment of evolutionary adaptation, the EEA. And so he's talking about how if people have a trait now, we need to inspect the evolutionary environment in which that trait evolved. And that goes for behavior and motivations as well as, anything else, the shape of the nose or the size of the feet. And so I just wanted to point that out, because a lot of times we look at our modern life and say, well, why the hell do I have this kind of behavior, this kind of motivation? And it can be kind of a relief to look at it in terms of, the prehistoric evolutionary environment. But that's all I have to say about that. I just wanted to point it out.
But what you're highlighting is the basis for evolutionary mismatch, right?
Yeah.
Because this is something that Heather Heying and Brett Weinstein cover in their book a lot. I mean, their book, I would say, is almost exclusively about evolutionary mismatch.
And I love that concept. It's just, it explains so much, and it's such a nice tool. It's such a nice framework to put around things. It's really a relief to me.
Yeah, and I'm curious then, because I feel like the evolutionary mismatch concept it's really useful, but it also, like, there are different things that emerge to me at different times as like the prominent example of evolutionary mismatch in my mind, you know, and it just happens to be uh, where I'm portioning my attention at that point in time. And I'm curious then, when you think of evolutionary mismatch, what's the sort of clearest example that's got your attention at this point in time?
Oh, I can't remember.
You can't remember.
Well, I can't think of it right now. You know, I'm sure I knew this morning. I'm sure I had 5 handy examples. I mean, because as I was reading this book, I kept going, oh yeah, mismatch, mismatch. I think I mean a lot of it is around social things. Um Not just with evolutionary mismatch, but the sort of use it or lose it aspect of culture.
Mm.
So, for example, if you know, if you don't need to see far away, you will lose your ability to see far away, and so now everyone's stuck with glasses. And it's like because we weren't using our distance vision, we just plain lost it. And so it's a kind of reverse evolutionary mismatch. It's a failure to hold on to one of the goods of evolution because the modern environment doesn't provide for their keeping. But then also the modern environment, I I guess when I think about morality and just social interaction, um, a lot of stuff about evolutionary mismatch comes up, but by golly, I can't think of any.
Well, they on that thing of vision, an interesting example. Have you read a hunter
No, I
gatherer's
haven't.
guide? I keep sort of fumbling the gatherer. I keep just going a hunter gatherer, the hunter gatherer's guide. So there's a really good example in there of, you know, the sort of optical illusions that we see, where you have two lines next to each other
Yeah.
and they're the same length, but most people who look at them will think they're a completely different length, but you can measure them and they turn out to be the same length. Apparently, there are a number of, or there's been some psychological experiments on hunter-gatherer communities today that show they can detect they don't fall for this optical illusion the way that everyone else does. And the best explanatory theory offered so far is that basically we weren't adapted to, our eyesight didn't evolve in an environment where there were loads of straight lines, and everything was sort of square and linear. And you know, it's a classic saying in the army when they're teaching you to detect irregularities. They say, there's no such thing as a straight line in nature. And basically, because we haven't had to notice the irregularities of lines, we're worse at detecting differences because we're just inundated with lines all the time. And it's such a small and subtle thing that I'm really happy that someone did that experiment, because it's one of those tiny incremental steps that I was talking about earlier, where it's like, oh, this is why we fall for that optical illusion. It's like, it feels, some people might look at that and go, what a pointless experiment. Why does it matter? But it does matter, you know. That's like, that's progress. That little bit, that little drop in the ocean of human knowledge helps it to grow.
Well, I think that brings us nicely to memetics.
Yeah.
And so I have something to say about these chapters in the book.
Okay.
So I just want to say that the chapters in The Ape That Understood the Universe on memetics were the most maddening and occasionally stupid chapters, while being at the same time the most fascinating and full of import. And I got so much out of them, but also he was completely crazy in some portions of what he was saying. So
give an example.
okay, so here's an example. He was talking, so all right, so mimetics, all right. So first of all, I have a grumble about how Dawkins spoke about mimetics. I haven't read Dawkins, but I do have what Steve Stewart-Williams wrote about Dawkins. And he said that, hold on, where's my notes? Dang it, where is it? So the gene's eye view of natural selection, which
Yeah.
I'm right there with the gene's eye view. Absolutely, it makes total sense. I think that's been demonstrated. So natural selection, argued Dawkins, acts on replicators. A replicator is any entity that makes copies of itself. And so he describes memes, so bits of culture, ideas, whatever, as replicators. But memes aren't replicators. Memes are replicated. They don't self-replicate. And I think that's a really important difference, because it means that mimetics, with all its value, and that value is great, is in large part merely a metaphor. And it's just saying, okay, there are selection pressures on the units of culture, which is very clearly true. But when, he said, so again, it was Dawkins who first proposed that cultural elements are selected only in as much that they benefit themselves. Well, what does it mean for a meme to benefit? Like, a meme can't be benefited. A meme can only propagate. So it's basically saying cultural elements only propagate insofar as they propagate. It's like that's a truism. It's dumb and it's annoying. And so it makes me mad that anyone should say something so vapid. Like,
So I have a question for you arising from that then. What do you see the benefit to a gene being beyond propagation?
but genes propagate themselves, and by definition, gene propagation is called benefit to the gene. But what people really mean is that they propagate. And so, but genes are self-propagating. And so, like, genes propagate. It's dumb to say, oh, genes propagate because they propagate. I knew you were going to ask that question. I developed an answer ahead of time and I lost it. Because that is, of course, the question.
So the reason I asked that question is because I find the conceptualization of gene driven evolution as a theory, it makes total sense. Like, I'm not arguing against it, but I think the way we conceptualize it as a positive process of genes being motivated to propagate themselves is slightly misleading. I don't think that there is a motivation to genes. I just think along the temporal dimension, when you look at what is the things that are most likely to exist across a long span of time, are the things that replicate, or anything that happens to be infinite, if you can name one, because I can. And so it's not that genes are motivated to replicate, it's that genes that do not create motivations to replicate do not replicate, and therefore they can only exist in the snapshot. So there has been many genetic mutations that, in all probability, there's been more genetic mutations that have completely vanished from the gene pool than those that have succeeded. And so I view it more as a negative process of deletion, where those that do not replicate are deleted. And so when I think of it that way, it translates far better to memetics, because on a temporal dimension, you get countless ideas that come up, and most of them will not survive any test of time. But some of them will be exceptionally good at transmitting themselves from one person to another, to another, to another. And whether you see that as replication, as an action by the meme itself, that obviously that's not possible, because a meme is well, I'm not going to say it's not possible, because I think that we get to, there's a very complicated philosophical thing there, but so that whether the meme is responsible for replicating itself, or the individuals are involved in replicating it, I don't think it's very easy to make that distinction, because the most successful replication ones will either have something that supports them. So, for example, if you view the sky being blue, because the sky isn't blue, it's a perceptual thing. If you view the idea that the sky is blue as being a meme, then that meme will continue to replicate, because everyone who looks up views the sky as blue. Whereas, so it has something to instantiate it in our perceptual experience, or it has to hijack something about our psychology to make us believe it. And conspiracy theories are a great example of this.
Yeah.
The recent re-emergence of the meme that the Earth is flat, that's to people, I guess that is intuitively driven, because when you go outside, that is reinforced by your perceptual experience, because you look around, and apart from hills and mountains, you can't see the curvature of the Earth.
Yeah.
And one of the examples that comes up to me the most obviously is sort of postmodernist ideology, which has replicates in a parasitical style, because it's often detrimental to the host, okay, the person who is propagating the meme and believes it, or continues to talk about it and spreads it. And as people who are somewhat opposed to postmodernist ideology, we probably hold some responsibility for this as well, because we keep bloody talking about it.
You just made me think of my favorite example of evolutionary mismatch.
Okay, go on.
So thank you for mentioning it. And that is that wokeness is a great example of evolutionary mismatch, because human beings have evolved to possess an instinct for, spiritual narratives or overarching narratives, whatever. Let's call it a spiritual. Humans evolved in cultural contexts that had quite a bit of room for anything we could call spiritual. And now our cultural environment is basically a secular one, an atheistic one. And so this spiritual slash religious ability in humans is left sort of there, and that's how wokeness gets in, because it's evolutionary mismatch, because the spiritual slash religious was providing something, and I think I disagree with a lot of what Steve Stewart-Williams says about religion, but I think it was providing at least one or two or three things to people: social cohesion, and just a way of dealing with self-consciousness, among other things.
Yeah.
And so religion slash spirituality filled a need that was created by cultural development in the cultural milieus that allowed spirituality and religion to develop. So we have that parallel evolution of culture and human capacity. And so now that culture has dropped that, but sorry, what I meant to say was, during that time, it was actually doing something for people. Like, religion really did do something. It wasn't just a meme. It was something that actually, allowed us to become self-aware.
Well,
And
arguably, it still does quite a lot, because the research tends to indicate that people who are actively engaged in religious practices are happier, they live longer, they have less health issues, and spiritual transformation is considered to be is one of the most well-evidenced cures for addiction. So it still does have that capacity. I just wanted to add that on.
okay. Although I think it depends on cultural context whether religiosity confers a longer life, from what I've read, although I haven't read much. But so we're in a new environment. We have this spiritual ability, and there's no spirituality slash religion to be found, especially because we had also been using religion to tell us what was true, and now we have science to tell us what was true. But there's all these true things that aren't scientific, the truths that are supplied by mythology, etc. And so it's this evolutionary mismatch. It's hijacking that ability, and it's detrimental. It's detrimental to the individual who takes it on, and it's also detrimental to society.
Yeah, I want to. I feel like there's some of that that's a bit confused, or at least it feels confused to me, which is the evolutionary timeline. I don't think most of human evolution featured a religion as such. It almost definitely, combinations of different evolutionary faculty led to the emergence of religion, and it's almost certain that there would have been some forms of superstitious belief as explanatory theories for what was going on in the world. But I think religion, in terms of, I get, maybe I'm thinking specifically of organized religion, and that's where my confusion is coming from.
Yeah, and that's why
That's a more recent phenomenon.
Yeah, and that's why I said spirituality as well. When I think of more, if you want to call them primitive religions or whatever, they're either nature oriented, or they're, people are kind of either worshiping their ancestors or sort of remaining in communication with their ancestors, like they're trying to engage with their dead ancestors as a means of strengthening themselves, strengthening their communities, gaining in wisdom. And I'm pretty sure I think that goes back a long way.
Yeah. Yeah, invariably it will, because if you think, I suspect that some sort of, actually, I feel like I have a hunch that there would have been some form of ritualistic group practices that existed in hunter-gatherer communities prior to Homo sapiens, but that's a big assumption, so I don't want to state it with any certainty because it's what I feel is most intuitive, but I haven't looked at enough on it to be sure of that. One of the interesting things, though, that I thought of then when you were talking about looking to religion for truths is I've been listening to a lecture series by Daniel Robinson, who was a psychologist and philosophy lecturer at Oxford for a couple of decades, I think it was. He passed away a few years ago. And he was talking, the lecture series I'm listening to is like the great ideas of philosophy, and there was two lectures back to back. There was one on Stoicism, and then the next one was on the sort of rise of Christianity. And basically, the Stoics believed that there was a natural order that we could find through observing the patterns of reality, which isn't it's sort of that everything happens for a reason idea. And while while I can see people argue against it, sort of say no, there's a lot of chance and everything like that, they were basically saying that the patterns are so complex that we cannot know them at this point in time, which, you know, I don't think it's settled whether that's the case or not. There is, what I suspect is that human limitations are going to mean that we never resolve that issue definitively. But the idea that if you knew enough, you could understand everything that happens in the universe and its patterns and make predictions, that's an idea that's up for debate, I would say. And basically, the rise of Christianity was, there was a debate in the early days of Christianity about whether God should be represented as something embodied or something more corporeal. Is that the right word?
That's also embodied.
Oh no. So what?
Corporeal, I
Incorporate?
suppose.
No, I'm trying to think what more mystic. I don't know. I can't think of the right word, but something not embodied, something that is sort of transient and basically
Not
God.
transient, but transcendental, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm hoping that the point's clear enough that anyone listening will be able to figure out what I mean. The opposite of embodied is what I mean. Basically, whether God was more abstract and conceptual, or whether God should be represented as something physical and embodied, because God was effectively a metaphor for what the Stoics were calling the natural order of things. You know, God was the source of these natural rules that are beyond human comprehension. And so I think that quite often atheistic arguments against religion present it as if it is something that it wasn't, in saying that it sort of, they say it arose as an explanatory theory claiming to be the truth, whereas it was sort of it was recognized, certainly in substantial parts of the religion, as a metaphorical or mythological means of explaining and understanding the world in a similar way to what the Stoics were doing. And it was the Stoic ideas had a significant influence on that emergence. But that was quite a so that was quite a tangent. But to get back to the evolutionary mismatch, I think that one of the big causes for the spread of wokeism or postmodernist ideology, or whatever you particularly want to call it, is more, I put it down to two things. One is that religious instinct or religious impulse that seems to have evolved within humans. So I agree with you on that. But I think one of the other examples is the evolutionary mismatch with our social interactions, our social networks, our social environment, because we evolved in very small and relatively closed off and static environments. Like, maybe people did move, we managed to get from Africa to the rest of the world, but that was over very vast periods of time. You wouldn't have significant interactions with other groups of hunter-gatherers till quite some distance into our evolutionary history and so on. And so we evolved to manage certain patterns of interactions with people and how we interact. So it's like, what part of I think this was in The Righteous Mind as well, talking about Robert Triver's work on reciprocal altruism, which is basically suggesting that we learn to be altruistic to non-kin because we lived in such small environments that the probability was that anyone you were altruistic towards was going to reciprocate at some point later down the line. And I know altruism came up in The Ape That Understood the Universe as well.
There was a whole chapter about it,
which we failed to call to Tutu at any point during it. So, and one of the things that I've spoken about a few times on this podcast, I think, and something that I find myself coming back to and that I want to dig into more, is the effect of the internet and particularly social media on, it feels to me like it magnifies existing dynamics that have evolved. So we have a proclivity towards people who are more similar to us. Generally, one of the strongest predictors, one of the things that we value most, is values and sort of culture that is similar to ours, because that's mediates social relationships far better. And I would hazard a guess that visual distinction, so the value of visual distinction in preferences for people who are similar to you, so things like ethnicity, for example, would be a cue to shared cultural values, because the probability is that someone who looks like you is more likely to be part of your shared culture. But again, that's a speculative statement on my part.
I don't think it's speculative at all. And I think we show it in our clothing more than anything else. I mean, isn't that how we use clothing to represent what our culture is? I mean, when I was running for office, Robin, I knew which people were going to vote for me just by looking at their clothing. Any woman wearing purple, she, gave me a big smile. It's just like, it was it was cultural and it was represented in dress. Anyway, just wanted to break in. I think that's absolutely true.
That's interesting, because I remember my younger days where I was listening to a lot of metal, and if you were wearing a Slayer t-shirt, other people in the street who liked Slayer might just randomly shout Slayer at you. So clearly there's some truth to that. But when we existed in small communities, or prior to social media, we would interact with people in our local vicinity a lot more, because those were the people we had the option to interact with. It was nigh on impossible to speak to someone at the other end of the country with any regularity, let alone to be filming a conversation across the entire Atlantic Ocean. But that meant that we had to interact more with people who had a wider diversity of opinions and perspectives on things, and that formed some level of pressure for social conformity. You couldn't decide the earth was flat if everyone else in your village thought you were an idiot for thinking the world was flat, because it would be significantly disadvantageous to you. Whereas now, and I feel bad for the flat earthers. I don't actually like the what they believe is self-evidently false, but I feel like they get a lot of stick, and actually ripping on them and making fun of them is not the way to do it. But I'm using that example now, so I'm going to stick with it rather than just being overly empathetic, because that's
I
my
think
nature.
that's the way to do it. I think mockery is absolutely a tool that we should use. But go on.
Yeah, perhaps, and I probably do agree with you. It's just I'm 97th percentile in compassion, so I tend to feel overly empathetic towards people when sometimes I need to be less empathetic, but that's a whole different matter. So the rise of social media has enabled us to seek out people who are similar across the world. So now we no longer have that same social pressure for conformity. And if you have some out there view, such as the world is flat, you can now go online and you can have any number of people who will confirm your view, and it doesn't take a huge amount of people to say, yeah, you're right, for you to be able to withstand a much more immediate social pressure, you know.
Careful, because you're using the word conformity as in it, as if we're conforming to the social. We're losing the social pressure not to conformity, we're losing our social pressure to diversity.
I think it's both simultaneously, because there's diversity within the local environment in terms of diversity of ideas. And that's usually still true unless you live in somewhere like Brighton or Portland, to give one example for each country. But there is diversity there, but there are constraints to that. There's limits, right? You can't go, right? You can't be the only person that believes the royal family are lizards in that, so that there is a conformity that is like, okay, that view's too out there to some degree. So there's a pressure to a degree of conformity. But the ironic thing is that temptation towards conformity, to find people who agree with us through being online, people have become more formed to orthodox ideas within their given social group, at the expense of diversity that they would encounter within their immediate social environment, even though that extreme conformity that you see through these online social groups is a resistance to the pressures towards conformity in the immediate environment.
And I think that we can say that social media is a meme that has, to a large part, removed our opportunity, not just opportunity, but the requirement that we interact with diverse people. Like, social media has demolished that opportunity and that, shall we say, selection pressure.
Yeah, social media is more. I mean,
Well,
I guess it is a meme in itself, but it's almost like steroids for all memes. You know, any meme filtered through social media has an infinitely more significant probability of propagation.
but as a meme, I mean, like, writing is a meme, right?
Yeah.
Press is a meme, publication is a meme, and that totally changed humanity, right? And so this one, you know, not just social media, but, you know, the internet as a whole. And so it took away, basically, we all have to wear glasses now. Like, no one can see past like this far in front of their face, because we've lost the evolutionary environment in which we need to see past this far in front of our own face, because we no longer interact with people who are different from us.
Yeah. So does my conceptualization, because we went on to bring us back to where we were before we went off on returning to evolutionary mismatch, does my conceptualization of evolution as a negative deletory process make the meme propagation thing seem less ridiculous to you, or does your criticism still stand?
Well, I do think it helps. I don't think that meme propagation is ridiculous at all. I mean, I think it's absolutely true that memes are subject to natural selection pressures. I mean, to me, it's a no-brainer. It's you can just see that.
Yeah.
And I find it really fascinating to use that as a framework to examine how different selection pressures produce different memes, and to what extent, and how that works. Like, I was thinking about the meme of Rick rolling, for example. It's like, that's the meme of all memes, right? And it's like, you know, why is that such a meme? Well, because it's awesome. I mean, it's such a successful meme because it's such an awesome meme. But anyway, sorry, yeah, I think that the negative aspect is more palatable to me. One of the things I really objected to in his book was what I regarded as his really melodramatic use of words like infestation, infection, you know, what's the word that begins with a P?
Parasitic.
Yes. It's like, I mean, I get that as a metaphor, kind of, but I think it goes too far. It's too emotional. It's uselessly emotional, and it bothers me. The idea of meme as parasite, because, like, a meme doesn't have a body, so it can't be a parasite. It's just a thing. And I think that he's so into this parasite thing that he just latches on to the memes that seem parasitic to him. For example, his whole conversation about music, all he kept talking about were earworms. He wasn't really studying music. He wasn't examining music. I'll bet you he's not musical at all, because the only music he has is earworms. He has no idea of the evolutionary benefits that music would supply to humanity. He doesn't even talk about them. I think in music, religion, and well, those were the two that I thought he was most weak on, because he had the most limited view of. And those were the two that he was most likely to see as parasitic, instead of really applying his own principles of natural selection and mimetic selection to those, and really understanding how they work in the brain and what they do and don't do for people.
Yeah, I see. I'm not. I feel like that chapter, he was just like, he didn't go through it with the same thoroughness of taking you through step by step as he did with the previous sort of evolutionary process and explaining the gene's eye view and things like that. I think partially because he was like, well, I've already laid out the model for how this works, so just, swap out genes for memes. And he just sort of like ran through some examples. And funnily, one of the examples he used was economics, which, like I said, I keep coming back to the same thing, because the economy is a evolutionary process as well. But I didn't find the um, language to do with viruses and parasites and stuff to be emotional, because it's actually a metaphor that's been used quite a lot. Because like Andy Norman had his book Mental Immunity that he said was about mind viruses and protecting yourself from mind viruses. Gad Saad had his book The Parasitic Mind, which used the same metaphor. Dawkins, when he sort of originated the idea of memes, he spoke of the capacity for them as parasites. I think I've read that. I've read someone else referring to Dawkins there. I haven't actually read The Selfish Gene, although the most observant people amongst me will see it's right behind me. It's just a big book. So I'm waiting to find the time to read it. And I think it's a reasonable metaphor, because if you think about the memes that replicate the best are the ones that will survive the longest. Sometimes the memes that replicate the best, this is me trying to frame it all in the dilatory manner that I'd framed it earlier. The memes that replicate the best and survive the longest do not necessarily have to be beneficial to their host, and they can be detrimental to their host. And that is definitionally what a parasite is. It is something that latches on to a host and for its own benefit, or reaps benefits from it while being detrimental to the host. So I think parasite, or a parasitic relationship between host and meme, is a reasonable description. There's maybe an issue with saying it literally, to say so parasite rather than parasitic relationship maybe becomes an issue. This is getting into the realm of semantics now, because we tend to use parasite to describe something that is biological, whereas memes aren't biological, they're psychological.
But he used such language throughout this chapter, and he used it to describe memes in general, not just the ones that are not beneficial to the mind that holds them. So, I mean, he was constantly saying, different, the history of the human animal consists of different species of meme battling it out for control of our minds and bodies. It's like, what? Knowledge controls our minds, you know? And then he goes, memes and memeplexes evolved to habit and exploit human minds. It's like, what? Cooking is an exploitation of the human mind? It's like there's so many memes are, I just don't think his framework is complete. It's a powerful framework, but it's not showing us how the role of consciousness in any of this. And he doesn't, he has a completely wacko, to me, understanding of creativity. There's a quote: creativity is just plagiarism that you don't admit. And it's like, no. Creativity is putting old things together in new ways. It's like every new thing is a new thing, and if it's innovative enough, it's called creativity. And so, and I told you yesterday I was watching these videos on engineering failures, right? And it's like, okay, so each new engineering innovation, you could call that a meme, but those memes were created by the men who created them. I mean, and they were trying to solve novel problems. I mean, this problem came up. They had the memes in their brain, but they were applying these memes. They were applying math, all kinds of algorithms, knowledge of materials, all kinds of experience to create something new, to create a bridge that had never been created before. So, which sometimes created a new problem and a disaster, and then they'd have to reflect on that. So, I'm not. I still believe that this idea of parasitism and all the rest is too emotional and overwrought. I think that he uses those words too much for memes in general. I think the only thing I've ever read about memes, with the exception of a few short and very interesting online articles, is in this book. And so I admit there's a lot I don't know about its explanatory power, but I didn't see anything in here that distinguishes or tries to tease apart memetics from, human creativity, human innovation, and human thought and problem solving.
Well, when you are thinking about it, are you making the link between memetics and the biological cultural co-evolution that we were talking about earlier on in the discussion? Because,
well, that's what I find most valuable in all this. Punt this whole thing on viruses and whatnot. The important thing, the almost magical thing is biological and cultural co-evolution. I mean, that's where all the gold is in this book.
Because when I think about genes, not all genes are beneficial to the organism. And we go back to the peacock's tail, there was a disadvantage, and that's that. But the vast majority of genes that continue to be in the gene pool are beneficial to the organism, because the organism, as the host, their survival and success has a fairly significant utility to the host and the gene.
Although I wouldn't call I wouldn't call any organism a host for its genes. It is the body that was built by the genes.
Well, I believe that in his final definition, when he's building up the definition of evolution, he describes the organism as a vessel for the genes.
Okay, by all means, let's call them a vessel. But it's a vessel the same way that a snail shell is a vessel for the snail. The snail built that shell.
Yeah. And so humans are also a vessel for memes.
Sure. I
And
like vessel much more than host. Yes.
yeah. And many memes will be advantageous to their vessel because the continued life of the continued survival of the vessel is beneficial to the meme, whereas a percentage of memes will be detrimental to their vessel so long as they enable the meme to continue. So would I be right in feeling like in interpreting what you're saying is basically you feel like there's a need for a different linguistic framework for discussing these phenomena just because you feel like the current one doesn't represent the non-physical entities that are memes, and that it implies a one-sided dynamic rather than coevolution.
I would say yes. And not only that, that I feel strongly that such a linguistic framework must already exist. It's just that he's not using it. I certainly hope so. I certainly hope that people are able to talk about memes as if they are not indeed self-replicating and that they don't indeed build bodies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, that's fine. I just wanted to clarify that really and make sure I was interpreting it correctly. One of the final things that he said that he did in this book, and admittedly I skim read this bit because I sort of felt like I'd got the gist enough that it didn't feel like it warranted a deep dive, but I appreciated that he did this. Was he basically committed a final section to being like, here are frequent objections and arguments that people might make against this, and here's how that argument plays out.
Yeah.
And I feel like that could be very useful to people who are reading it and coming up with those objections as they do. I sort of feel like because I've wrestled with these ideas and had some base level knowledge that I could anticipate what was coming in that bit. So I was able to skim it and go, does it confirm my expectation or is there something in there that's not? And I didn't find anything. So I just wanted to give a little bit of acknowledgement for the fact that he did that. But I think that I had another point I wanted to make before that, and I forgot it. So actually, I was just that was me filibustering to get
Well,
until my point returned.
because the appendices were awesome, and I didn't talk about them either. I didn't make notes about them, but you know, I've got all kinds of like stars and notes and hearts and smiley faces throughout the appendices. They're great. I have one last thing that I want to say.
Yeah.
And this has to do with my criticism of the language that's used, and maybe I think he might be overstating the reality of memetics in human life, which is not to say it doesn't have value and great value, but I just don't think it's like 100% of things. I don't think memetics is 100% of culture. There's something else there. He's talking about milk, and he describes milk drinking as a meme, which it is. Drinking milk is a human behavior, therefore we can call it a meme. And it has produced evolution in the populations that drink milk. So, European populations, right on. But he talks about that meme as if it's like, well, first of all, he talks about it as if it's really gross, which you could say that it is. But on the other hand, drinking milk is no grosser than a mosquito sucking blood or a vampire bat. And so milk isn't a meme, it's a food source, you know, just like blood is for ticks and mosquitoes. And so it, he's pushing, I don't want to say he always, there are certain instances where he pushed something that's just so clearly biological. An organism exploiting a new food source is a biological thing. It's not necessarily a purely cultural thing. It can be viewed just through the lens of biology.
But there are cultures that don't drink milk.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And there are, you know, mosquitoes that don't drink blood. I mean, but we don't say that the blood-sucking mosquitoes have the blood-sucking meme and the non-blood. You know what I'm saying? It's biological.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that milk drinking isn't a meme, but I'm uncomfortable with like the claiming of it as a fully mimetic / cultural thing instead of something that really is truly largely biological and shared in species that don't have culture, that just simply evolve biologically.
Yeah, I feel, because now that I'm remembering that, he actually used that as an example of biological mimetic coevolution, didn't he? Because he was basically saying we learned to drink milk, so we started drinking milk, so we developed the capacity to drink milk because previously everyone was lactose intolerant, and so it also frames things differently for people who are lactose intolerant. The exception is those of us who can digest lactose. I say those of us. I haven't digested any form of lactose for so many years now that I don't know if I can or not. I used to be able to, but yeah. So I wanted to. There are two things that I want to say before we finish quickly. One of them is the second one I'll probably use as more as a sign off, but one of people's biggest objections, and I think this is more a discomfort thing, is that this lends itself to belief in determinism, or people assume it does because and it's one of the things that came up in the appendix, because if basically the argument goes, if our emotions and motivations are the result of an evolutionary process, are we, to use the quote Dostoevsky, are we nothing but the keys on a piano? You know, do we have free will? And this is part of one of the objections comes up, the selfish gene idea that Dawkins came up with is, you know, does it mean we're all selfish by default and even our altruistic behaviors are a result of selfishness on the genetic level? And I mean, I don't know how much consideration have you given to a retort for that, because otherwise I'm going to.
My retort is that I think both of those questions, sorry to speak the way that I speak, I think both of those questions are dumb, and I punt on both of them. And he does make a refutation of the whole altruism thing. Oh, it's really selfish. It's like, he says, what do you want? People to be altruistic and not enjoy it? You know? So it's like, isn't our definition of altruism mean that someone enjoys helping other people? And so I don't see a distinction between self-help and pro-social behavior. To me, the spectrum are pro-social, anti-social, healthy for the individual, unhealthy for the individual. And I see those things as almost always occupying the same line. And so if you do something to help others, you almost always are helping yourself, and vice versa. And sometimes that's not true, and we can talk about those times, but it's to me it's dumb to concern ourselves with those and like rack our brains about ways of solving that problem. To me, it's just not a problem. Likewise, the whole free will thing, I don't care. Like I don't care. The important thing is to act as if you have free will.
Yeah.
And I don't care if I don't, and maybe I don't. So, I think there I'm discovering more and more situations in life where indeed ignorance is bliss, and the less scientific view is the better view, is truly the better view. It's better for you and it's better for everyone. So who cares if it's wrong?
Yeah.
It's like, because if we go down that path, it's a suicidal path. And so if we are going to go ahead and think that life is good, we need to go ahead and have that illusion that life is good.
Yeah, I'd be inclined to agree with you, and that there are definitely, I've made the case a number of times when people have engaged me in a debate over free will, that ultimately I don't see it as a beneficial debate, because if it's decided we don't have free will, you still have to treat people like they have free will, because people don't like being treated like they don't have free will. So and whether your experience of having free will is illusionary or not, you still have that experience and you go through that process. You still have to make decisions. It's not like I'm going to go, I don't have any free will, therefore I don't have to make decisions anymore. I still have to make decisions. But to me, the issue with these arguments was to me, there's more of a beauty in it, and it ties in with your thing about it being good for the pro-social behavior generally being good for the individual as well. It's like we don't evolve to do these behaviors. Like I said when I was talking about domestic abuse, we don't evolve to do them. We evolve to have a proclivity towards these things, and that will be mediated through all sorts of hormonal responses. And if, to increase our probability of being altruistic, our brain has developed the capacity to release dopamine when we act in a pro-social manner. For example, then that is a positive thing. That's a beautiful thing, that we have evolved the capacity to be generous as well as to be cruel, and we have evolved cultures where being kind and tolerant and respectful is rewarded far more than their opposites, and we have evolved to feel good about those things and to enjoy it. So the fact that we can do good at all is a testimony to the evolutionary process in itself, like
Keeping in mind though that our very understanding of helping and compassion and all those things, our very understanding that those things are good was planted in us by evolution. Just saying.
Just to go meta. But yeah, and you can tie yourself in knots with those things for ages. It gets complicated. But I had one realization that felt quite profound to me when I was reading the final chapter, that I feel like makes a nice Although I feel like what I just said was probably quite a nice ending point anyway. But I'm going to add another one on just for the sake of it. That if the mimetic selection process is based on the things that are able to avoid deletion in the meme pool the most effectively, then nothing can be more resistant to deletion from the meme pool from that which is observably true. That means that over an expanse of time, no matter what sort of arises, the thing that has the biggest chance of survival is the truth, and truth will win out in the long term.
Yep. Hallelujah.